It began with a false sense of triumph. The rebels had believed they were closing in on a decisive victory. Their fleet emerged from hyperspace with a boldness that belied the truth. The Death Star loomed above the forest moon of Endor, and its incomplete appearance had lulled them into thinking they had the advantage. But the Emperor had planned this moment for years. What they thought was a flaw was bait, calculated to perfection. The station was fully armed, fully operational, and fully silent at first. No warning shots, no defensive flak. Then, without ceremony, it opened fire. One Mon Calamari cruiser evaporated instantly. The next followed seconds later, pierced through its core by a single beam. The rebels tried to scatter, but the targeting systems were locked in. The second Death Star didn't have the delays of its predecessor. The beam recharged in under a minute. The kill count rose with methodical precision. Chaos erupted among the rebel fleet. Admiral Akbar's calls for regrouping went unheard as jamming signals flooded communications. Pilots screamed into dead channels. Fighters banked hard, looking for exits that didn't exist. Interceptors flooded out from the hangars of star destroyers, flanking them like vultures closing in. Wedge Antilles led a squadron toward the Death Star's surface, just like the last time. But this wasn't Yavin. The trench never ended. Turbo lasers lined every inch. His X-wing was shredded before it made it halfway to the surface. Below, the shield generator on Endor still stood. The ground assault had failed. The Imperial garrison, prepared this time, had fortified the bunker with rotating auto turrets and air support. The Ewoks didn't stand a chance. Their traps were primitive. Their courage was admirable, but courage had no defense against napalm drops. Trees burned. Soil turned to glass. Smoke choked the moon's skies as walkers stamped out the last pockets of resistance. General Solo never made it off-world. On board the Death Star, Luke Skywalker stood before Emperor Palpatine. The duel with Vader had left him bloodied and bruised, but not broken. He'd stood over his father's body, saber raised, and chosen mercy. But Sidious didn't need him dead. He needed him shattered. The trap wasn't just for the fleet. It was for him. "You failed your friends," the Emperor whispered, as Luke stared out at the burning wreckage of his allies. "Their deaths are on your hands." The words cut deeper than any blade. Then came the cuffs. The Emperor never rose from his throne. He simply gestured, and Luke's body folded inward, crushed by unseen pressure. He collapsed. Vader's body was dragged away. No ceremony, no pyre. His armor would be repurposed for Sith propaganda, his legacy rewritten. As the rebels died above and below, live feeds transmitted the collapse across the galaxy. Viewers saw Leia forced to her knees, blood on her forehead, as stormtroopers surrounded her on the deck of a seized transport. She shouted something before the feed cut. Others were less fortunate. General Reekan's execution was televised without edits. His last words were silenced with a blaster bolt to the chest. Palpatine ordered the broadcasts to run in rotation, uninterrupted, across every major system. On Corellia, families watched in horror as rebel heroes were dragged into darkness. On Naboo, citizens lowered their heads as the Empire declared the end of the insurrection. Children asked who Luke Skywalker was. Their parents stayed quiet. Coruscant celebrated. Fireworks burst over the Imperial palace. Crowds cheered as the sovereign flag was raised above the skyline. In the upper levels, senators handpicked by the Emperor gave speeches lauding the defeat of the terrorist uprising. In the Undercity, dissenters disappeared overnight. An entire cell of rebel sympathizers was locked inside a collapsing building. No names were released. With the Death Star now mobile, Palpatine had no reason to remain in the shadows. He renamed it the Sovereign Star, a symbol of the Empire's absolute dominion. Systems that once resisted began offering tributes before even being asked. Neutral worlds declared loyalty in record time. Resistance became a death sentence. Silence became survival. Luke's imprisonment was never acknowledged publicly. The official story stated that he'd perished in the Battle of Endor. In truth, he was taken to the ancient world of Bis, one of the few remaining planets steeped in raw, unfiltered darkness. There, in chambers carved into volcanic stone, the Emperor began to unravel him. No droid interrogators, no shock collars, just whispers, lies layered into dreams, visions twisted by alchemical influence. Time passed differently on Bis. Minutes stretched, years bled into hours. Luke stopped counting. Back on Endor, Imperial engineers leveled the ruins of the battle. Forests were cleared. The moon's orbit was fortified. The bunker was rebuilt into a military outpost. Nothing of the battle remained. Not a single rebel body, not a single droid part. The story rewritten, the records locked. Endor had never been touched by rebellion. That's what the archives said. The Alliance wasn't buried, it was suffocated, word by word, world by world, not with a final blow, but with an ongoing erasure. The lights of rebellion were snuffed out in silence, no final cry, no grand last stand. Just darkness spreading from system to system, unchallenged. And in that darkness, the galaxy blinked and forgot. Palpatine did not merely celebrate victory, he codified it. With the Rebel Alliance dismantled and no Jedi left to stand in opposition, the Emperor moved swiftly to reshape the galaxy, not just its politics, but its very concept of time and memory. The galactic calendar, long marked by the pivotal Battle of Yavin, was abolished. A BY and BBY were declared obsolete terms, relics of a seditious past. In their place, a new dating system was instituted, Year 1 of the Sovereign Era. All historical records were recalibrated accordingly, time itself bent to the will of the throne. Official decrees no longer passed through advisors or senatorial sessions. There were no votes, no chambers. The Emperor's voice, when heard, was the law. When not heard, his silence meant stability. No councils convened, no discussions followed. The entire Imperial legal system was condensed into a single principle: obedience to the sovereign will. It applied to all beings, regardless of status or species. Deviation wasn't debated, it was eliminated. The title of Emperor quietly faded. It was too weak, too mortal. In its place, Palpatine took on a new designation: the Immortal Sovereign. Every child was taught the name from their first year in re-education hubs. Older citizens were re-taught through compulsory indoctrination broadcasts. Propaganda units patrolled cities, issuing knowledge correction mandates. The Immortal Sovereign was not a ruler in the traditional sense. He was described as the source of order, the anchor of reality. Statues were commissioned across the core worlds, monolithic structures, void of expression, with obsidian eyes that seemed to follow those who walked past. Holograms of Sidious flickered in every household. Some were static, some animated, depending on a citizen's compliance rating. Entire networks were dedicated to Imperial news service, where scripted celebrations of Imperial virtue aired around the cycle. Even leisure channels were monitored. Every comedy show, musical performance, or historical drama included mandatory reverence segments where cast members paused to offer thanks to the Immortal Sovereign. Those who skipped them found their homes flagged for monitoring. Dissent didn't require action. Suspicion alone was enough. Religion, which had once been fractured across hundreds of planetary belief systems, was unified under the new doctrine of galactic harmony. It preached devotion to the Immortal Sovereign as a stabilizing force across time and space. Jedi were not simply rebranded as traitors, they were labeled heretics. Shrines once dedicated to ancient Force traditions were demolished. In their place, new sanctuaries were built, windowless, circular chambers where daily recitations echoed through cold stone halls. Worship replaced loyalty, not by choice, but by saturation. In the Outer Rim, these sanctuaries doubled as recruitment centers for Force-sensitive children. Control was not confined to the physical. The Empire embedded surveillance directly into the language. Words like liberty, hope, and resistance were flagged in spoken communication. Droids equipped with linguistic pattern recognition were installed in city squares and transport hubs. Conversations that drifted too close to forbidden topics triggered silent alerts. A week later, one person wouldn't show up to work. No charges, no trial, just a reassigned apartment, a falsified work record, and a replacement. In the education system, children were raised without context. Galactic history began with the rise of the Sovereign era. The Republic was labeled a failed experiment, its chaos blamed for centuries of war. The Clone Wars were recast as a heroic campaign led by the Sovereign to purge corruption. Anakin Skywalker was never mentioned. Darth Vader was the Empire's founding general, unchallenged, unwavering, and victorious. Luke Skywalker was portrayed briefly as a misguided cultist who perished in a failed bombing attempt above Endor. Leia Organa was never born. Every child was required to pass biannual devotion assessments. These weren't tests of knowledge, they were emotional scans. Candidates were presented with images and audio of the immortal sovereign and monitored for physiological responses. Warmth, admiration, awe, acceptable. Discomfort, neutrality, anxiety, grounds for corrective programming. Entire schools were built underground, dedicated to the recalibration of children who scored below the approved reverence threshold. On Coruscant, the Imperial Palace expanded its perimeter. Entire districts were cleared to make way for the Ministry of Continuity, an agency devoted to the active rewriting of history. Archive teams combed through records, slicing and redacting every mention of dissent. Languages associated with former resistance worlds were banned in public. Names like Mon Mothma, Bail Organa, and Luthen Rael were excised from every digital trace. Even the concept of rebellion was rendered abstract, discussed only as a contagious madness cured by sovereign intervention. In the midst of this, no one stood to challenge the throne. Fleet commanders saluted to empty air. Governors spoke only in quotes approved by central databanks. When the immortal sovereign addressed the galaxy through high-frequency psychic broadcast, a dark side ritual known only to his inner circle, billions dropped to their knees, not because they understood, but because something in their minds collapsed. The dark tendrils of Palpatine's will didn't simply shape policy, they carved themselves into the subconscious of an entire species. Even in the unknown regions, far from the heart of Imperial rule, vessels bore his insignia. Mining colonies, pirate outposts, even neutral trade worlds, all declared fealty to a throne they had never seen, to a ruler they would never meet. The idea of the sovereign was heavier than his presence, and that was the point. Order, as defined by Palpatine, did not mean peace. It meant permanence. The galaxy didn't resist, because resistance had been surgically removed from its vocabulary. Next came the rebuilding of Force doctrine, not through the Jedi, through their inversion. Luke Skywalker was not killed. Death would have been a kindness. The Emperor had no use for martyrs. He needed a symbol, something twisted, something that could speak with the voice of the light while enforcing the will of the dark. A Skywalker stripped of rebellion, bound to his throne, and paraded through the stars. Not as hope reborn, but as its funeral. He was transported to Biss under heavy guard, not for fear that he would escape, but because Sidious wanted to isolate him completely from the known galaxy. No starlight, no contact, no memory of warmth or freedom. The world was chosen for its unnatural darkness. The planet fed on despair, warped the Force into a thick, oppressive fog. It was here that Palpatine began his work. Luke wasn't broken in one day. That wasn't the plan. The process was slow, deliberate, and clinical. No chains were necessary. His cell had no exits, and the walls bent space around him. Sith alchemists entered in pairs, their faces obscured by crimson veils. They spoke in chants, layered with Force manipulation that slithered through his thoughts. Nights blurred into days, days stretched into years. Time, as it was understood, meant nothing on Biss. The gravity itself pulsed with Sidious will. Memories were the first to fade, not all at once. At first, just voices, then images. He forgot the sound of Leia's laughter. He forgot Yoda's teachings. Eventually, he forgot the color of his father's eyes. The Force, which once answered his call in warmth and clarity, began to feel like a cold, unknowable presence. Palpatine didn't strip him of his power. He inverted it. Luke remained strong in the Force, but where once there was harmony, there was now fracture. Every time he reached for calm, he was met with anguish. Every attempt to resist was punished not with pain, but with illusion. The Force itself lied to him. The final break came with the crystal. A lightsaber was placed before him, dull and dead. Sidious gave the command. Luke was told to bleed the kyber, infuse it with his rage, his fear, his grief. He refused. Then he was forced to relive the deaths of his friends in endless replay, shown altered recordings where his inaction had doomed billions. Every failure, every doubt, amplified. At last, when he could no longer tell if any of it was real, the crystal responded. It turned red, deep, blood red, and screamed as it did. That sound never left him. They gave him armor next. Black, polished, imposing. Less bulky than Vader's, but no less cold. It was ceremonial and functional, designed not just to protect, but to intimidate. His new name was etched in Sith glyphs across the breastplate, Darth Solace. Not a name he chose, a mockery, the final cruelty. He would bring peace through submission, silence through dominance. Luke Skywalker was no more. His first mission was swift and unannounced. A rumored Jedi enclave in the Mid-Rim had resurfaced. Old survivors, hiding since the Purge. Darth Solace arrived alone. No battalion, no escort. Just the hum of his crimson blade and the crackle of Force lightning at his fingertips. It took less than an hour. No survivors. Their lightsabers were collected, crushed, and melted into a single monument, a hollow spire erected in the center of the settlement. The spire emitted a faint wail whenever the wind passed through it. Locals called it the tomb voice. No one spoke of the Jedi again. From that point on, his missions became legend, not through official reports, but through terrified whispers. Darth Solace arrived without warning. He levitated above the ground. He never spoke. He moved as if guided by inevitability. Resistance meant vaporization. Surrender meant vanishing. Survivors described the way he would stop and stare at children but say nothing. A man with a familiar face and no soul. The Emperor never let him rest. Solace became the enforcer of forgotten laws. Entire star systems felt the heat of his retribution. Ancient temples believed to hold Jedi relics were flattened. Cultures that preserved the memory of the Force were sterilized, their histories rewritten. Inquisitors followed him like shadows, eager to learn, fearful to speak. He wasn't their leader, he was their warning. Meanwhile, holodramas and state broadcasts told a different story. Luke Skywalker, the terrorist, had perished during the failed insurrection at Endor. Darth Solace was presented as the supreme guardian of order, forged in the crucible of chaos. His face was seen everywhere, but never as a man, always as a mask, always with the red blade, cutting through the sins of the past. The Jedi were not only outlawed, they were unpersoned. Their names were scrubbed from databanks. Monuments were crushed, artifacts seized. In time, stories of the Jedi were classified as myth. Children believed the Order had been a fairy tale, a superstition long abandoned. And when they saw Solace on the holonet, cloaked in black and radiating dread, they never once thought he could be one of them. As for Tatooine, it remained untouched, not by mercy, but by disinterest. The Empire didn't need the desert, and Luke would never return. The twin suns he once stared at as a boy would rise and fall without him, burning over sands that whispered his name to no one. Biss kept the rest, his thoughts, his memories, his ghost. Anakin Skywalker never returned, not in name, not in story. His final act, the moment of sacrifice when he turned against his master to save his son, was wiped from all official record. The galaxy was told that Darth Vader died in glorious service to the immortal sovereign, protecting the second Death Star from rebel sabotage. There was no mention of Luke, no betrayal, no redemption, only loyalty, absolute, unshakable, eternal. In the decades that followed, monuments of Vader were erected across Imperial systems. Some reached the height of cruisers, others were smaller, built into military academies, where cadets saluted the visor of a man who had once tried to destroy everything he now represented. There was no irony in it, no contradiction. The truth had been carefully rewritten, then buried beneath layers of curated propaganda. These statues did not honor a complicated past. They celebrated a myth of unbroken obedience. His armor became sacred, not as a relic, but as a relic remade. A select group of Sith artisans, loyal only to Sidious, reforged the original plating into ceremonial replicas. One piece, the helmet, was sealed in a black obsidian cube and placed at the heart of the Imperial Cathedral on Coruscant. The cube hovered over an eternal fire, which never dimmed, even when exposed to vacuum. Every year, a procession of Force adepts marched beneath it, chanting the litany of power. The cube never opened. None were allowed to touch it. But across the galaxy, it was treated like a divine object. From this artifact, a distorted version of Vader's life was spun into Sith gospel. Not a man once torn between light and darkness, but a warrior born from purpose and honed in wrath. His past as Anakin Skywalker was rewritten as fiction, fabricated by rebel sympathizers seeking to confuse Imperial youth. Jedi texts referencing him as a former general were reclassified as subversive documents. Possession alone was enough for exile. In the Sith academies, initiates were taught the Chronicle of the Shadow Flame, a doctrinal rewrite that described Vader's rise as inevitable, foretold by ancient prophecy and executed through divine will. The fall of the Jedi, the extermination of the Separatists, the destruction of traitorous clones, all attributed to his visionary loyalty. No mention of Mustafa's duel, no Obi-Wan, no conflict, just discipline and ascension. Acolytes studied his purity. They dissected training holograms and security footage, tracing the movements of his lightsaber swings, measuring breath cadence, posture, kill ratios. Some even mimicked his gait. Others volunteered for voice modulation, requesting deeper registers to match his former tone. One sect, calling themselves the Order of Black Silence, practiced week-long meditations while masked, breathing only through specially manufactured filters. These rituals were never questioned. They were encouraged. Every holodrama, documentary, and sanctioned biography repeated the same narrative. Vader was the Empire's sword, perfected by suffering and blessed by the Sovereign himself. His final battle, they claimed, was an act of martyrdom, intercepting a rebel vessel about to detonate a gravity bomb above the Death Star's core. His death saved millions. His legacy, they said, would outlive stars. And yet cracks persisted beneath the story's surface. Older clones, those who'd fought alongside Anakin during the Clone Wars, were forced into memory audits. Those who spoke the wrong name were reassigned, silenced, or quietly phased out. Temple guards on Coruscant were forbidden from speaking during duty. Imperial historians were selected not for accuracy, but for obedience. Even whispers of the truth were treated as contagion. Padme Amidala was the greatest threat to that truth. Her name, once etched into the records of the Galactic Senate, vanished completely. Not just hidden, banned. Senators who remembered her were interrogated. Archives from Naboo were locked under planetary encryption. The hollows of her speeches were erased frame by frame. Her grave was desecrated and replaced with a blank plinth marked "Unknown Citizen." Her face became an outlawed image. The connection between Padme and Vader was unspoken by design. To preserve the myth of the unwavering enforcer, there could be no weakness in his legacy, no love, no family, no faltering. The story of Anakin Skywalker, the man who once knelt before her in a theed balcony garden, was not denied. It was undone. Tatooine was placed under indirect surveillance but otherwise ignored. It was treated as an unremarkable world, irrelevant to the narrative. No Imperial document ever referenced the Skywalker name in relation to its sands. Locals who remembered the boy from the Lars homestead kept their mouths shut. A few who spoke too freely found themselves escorted into transport shuttles and never returned. Vader's descendants, if acknowledged at all, were spoken of only in hushed tones among the upper echelons of the Sith priesthood. Genetic speculation was forbidden, though a select few inquisitors privately maintained genetic archives, hoping to one day track unawakened heirs. These efforts were unofficial, dangerous, but curiosity in the dark often survives bureaucracy. In the end, the Empire succeeded in one thing: it silenced the truth, not through simple denial, but through meticulous replacement. Vader was no longer a man. He was a monument, a sermon, a doctrine etched into the bones of 1,000 systems. And above it all, the immortal sovereign watched, satisfied. Leia Organa didn't fall at Endor. She vanished. As the Death Star completed its massacre above, a stolen Corellian cruiser broke through a blind spot in the fleet's encirclement, its hyperdrive rigged to override course restrictions. It was a patchwork of chaos, stolen codes, rerouted signals, a captain barely conscious from shrapnel wounds. But it worked. Just once. And once was enough. There were fewer than 30 survivors on board. Most were engineers, comms officers and gunners. No high command, no Jedi, no full squadrons. Just remnants, ghosts of a movement that no longer existed. Leia didn't speak for hours. Her white tunic was stained red at the hem, and she clutched a blaster like it was the last memory of someone else's hand. She refused a med scan. She barely moved. But something was changing in her, quietly, like a storm tightening its spiral. The Force had always been near her, brushed past her in quiet moments, but now it surged, not like a gift, like a warning. She began to feel things before they happened. hear thoughts not her own. She knew when they were being scanned. She knew the moment a sector checkpoint ahead had detected them, even before the alarms blared. The crew started following her instincts without question. No one asked how she knew. No one dared. With every jump through unstable hyperspace lanes, she felt the net drawing tighter. The Empire hadn't forgotten her. Sidious had dispatched Inquisitors with a single directive: bring her back alive. For what purpose, no one could say. They chased her across dust worlds and mining rings, through abandoned separatist foundries and ancient ruins. Sometimes she escaped by inches. Sometimes the crew wasn't so lucky. The cruiser lost people. Entire compartments were sealed off mid-flight to contain fires, radiation leaks, or boarding parties. By the 6th month, only 9 were left, then 5. Leia didn't mourn publicly. She carried names in silence, buried them in small ceremonies behind closed blast doors. On one occasion, she floated the body of a pilot into the void and recited Alderaanian poetry under her breath, though no one else remembered the verses. She never stopped planning, never stopped moving. But her eyes became harder with every jump. The turning point came on Hoth. Not the rebel base. It had been obliterated in an early retaliatory strike. But further north, beyond the ice plains, deep beneath a frozen shelf, there was a thermal vent. Leia knew it existed before she ever saw a map. The ship landed on near-zero power. Atmospheric stabilizers were bypassed. Every sensor deactivated. They became invisible. The crew was gone by then. She was alone, except for the life growing inside her. She gave birth in silence. No midwife, no droids, just melting snow for water, and the hollow echo of her own voice when the cave shook from her scream. 2 children, twins. One cried immediately. The other was silent until Leia held him against her chest. Their names were never spoken aloud. No records, no data entries. Just heat pressed against frozen skin and the quiet, uncertain rhythm of new breath. Leia stayed there for years, raised them among frost-worn cliffs and scavenged Imperial debris. She trained herself using fragments of Jedi holobooks she'd salvaged from a ruined frigate, their instructions half corrupted. Her powers grew wild but focused. At times, she could lift entire slabs of ice from a collapsed tunnel. Other times she stood paralyzed, hearing voices through the force that didn't belong to her children. The Inquisitors never stopped searching, but Hoth's storms were unforgiving, and most sensors shorted out within hours. One patrol landed once. She saw them from the ridge. She did not run. She waited. When they entered the valley, none came out. What happened inside was never documented. Their ship was found weeks later, buried in snow, stripped of its core. No bodies, no lightsaber scars, just one scorch mark across the entrance, a burn that didn't match any known weapon. Over time, stories began to surface, not in cities, not over open comms, in whispered bar tabs on Nar Shaddaa, in encrypted exchanges between slicers in the mid-rim. A woman with royal eyes and warrior's hands. A child with hair like shadow who could crush metal without touching it. A sister who walked barefoot across frost without leaving footprints. None of it confirmed. But the tales spread. The Empire dismissed it as superstition. Rebel holdouts clung to the myth, passing it on like contraband. They called her the Hollow Flame. Others said she was already dead, and the sightings were echoes from the Force. Those closest to the truth stayed silent. Too many were still hunted. Leia Organa never resurfaced. Not officially. No recordings. No sightings on secure channels. But her name became something else. Less a person, more a possibility. For the galaxy that forgot what freedom felt like, that was enough. Somewhere beyond Imperial charts, she watched her children grow. After the fall of the rebellion, the mask came off. What had been carefully maintained under the guise of order was now made official policy. Slavery, once practiced discreetly or outsourced through corporate proxies, became the foundation of Imperial infrastructure. No longer limited to backwater planets or lawless sectors, it was sanctioned, regulated, and enforced on a galactic level. The language was sanitized in government archives, labor realignment, biological output optimization, but every citizen knew what it meant. If you weren't born into privilege, you worked until your body failed. Each system was audited by the Ministry of Social Integrity. Species were scored on a scale from 1 to 7, based on loyalty potential, physiological resilience, and cultural volatility. Humans ranked highest by default, though not all were spared. Twi'leks, Mon Calamari, Rhodians, and Ithorians fell in the middle range, useful but watched. Wookiees, Togrutas, and Tals ranked lowest. Their strength was viewed as threat, not asset, so they were heavily restrained, worked under constant surveillance, and routinely punished regardless of infraction. Kashyyyk was cordoned off entirely. Declared an industrial reserve, the entire planet was turned into a supply chain for the Empire's construction projects. Wookiees were shackled in droves, marched into deforested craters, and forced to transport materials by hand, durasteel, hyperdrive cores, and even kyber fragments. Their natural resistance to physical fatigue made them ideal laborers. Their loyalty to one another made them dangerous. So they were separated. Family units were forbidden. Any attempt at communication not in basic was met with stun batons or worse. The Empire's obsession with efficiency extended beyond biology. Droids were reprogrammed en masse. Behavioral inhibitors were no longer just standard, they were permanent. Units that once displayed hints of personality were recalled and stripped of memory cores. Sentient interaction between droids and organics became a monitored offense. Any protocol droid that offered unsolicited opinion was immediately decommissioned. R2 series astromechs, known for independence and improvisation, were banned entirely outside military use. A generation of mechanical minds was silenced, not with violence, but with code. Education was no longer a universal right. It became a privilege, and that privilege was reserved exclusively for the human elite. Core worlds such as Chandrila and Corellia hosted private Imperial academies where curriculum focused on history as dictated by the sovereign. Critical thinking was discouraged. Students were taught how to follow, not question. Outer Rim territories received only the basics, just enough to ensure laborers could read schedules and operate machinery. Access to advanced study required bloodline verification and a loyalty certification. Libraries were filtered. Access terminals in lower districts carried no historical archives, no galactic cartography, and no political theory. Fiction was monitored for subversive sentiment. Art programs were abolished in favor of loyalty training. Music was reduced to state-approved anthems. Cultural identity, particularly among non-human populations, was systematically diluted. Languages were erased from formal instruction. Dialects were mocked in holodramas, and anyone caught speaking them in public faced disciplinary sentencing. Citizens were ranked not only by species, but by class and proximity to service. Those closest to the Empire, administrators, officers, technicians, were given clean housing, guaranteed rations, and a 7-hour work shift. The next tier lived in dormitory blocks, fed nutrient paste, and rotated through 12-hour labor cycles. The final tier, the unranked, had no homes, no records, and no rest. They lived where they worked. They died where they slept. And the only replacement for their absence was another name added to a digital registry, flagged for pickup. Starships became symbols of unreachable freedom. Entire populations lived on planets without access to spaceports. Permits for off-world travel were restricted to military, commerce, or diplomatic operations. Private ships were outlawed. Even if someone could scrape together enough credits, there was nowhere to buy, nowhere to fly, and nowhere safe to land. The stars faded from public life, not because they were gone, but because they were no longer relevant. A child born on a factory world would die under the same sky, never knowing what lay beyond it. Throughout all this, resistance became near impossible. Surveillance towers were standard in every urban zone. Each block had at least one informant. Loyalty programs rewarded betrayal. Families were split and incentivized to report one another for resource bonuses. Communication between worlds was throttled. Long-range transmissions required a clearance key only issued by sector governors. Smugglers and slicers operated in deep secrecy, but many were captured and broadcast as examples. Punishments were public. Executions were routine. But the Empire discovered that humiliation worked faster than fear. Individuals accused of disobedience were forced to perform acts of penance, singing loyalty oaths, crawling through streets in shackles, or denouncing loved ones on holoscreens. These displays broke communities before a shot was ever fired. The Jedi were still spoken of, but not by name. Workers passed down half-remembered stories of lightsabers and stars and protectors in robes. No dates, no faces, just shapes and silence. In some corners of the galaxy, parents gave their children old names with quiet defiance. But in most places, survival required forgetting. The chains were not always physical. The Empire learned to wrap them in policy, in language, in routine. And once bound, the galaxy forgot it had ever moved freely. Once the Jedi were gone, the Force didn't fade, it fractured. And the Empire had no intention of letting that power go untapped. A new order was needed, one that did not nurture, but control, one that did not teach balance, but domination. So the search began, quietly at first, then with growing boldness. Children who showed unnatural reflexes, unexplained visions, or emotional outbursts strong enough to affect their surroundings were flagged. The screenings expanded across the core and into the mid-rim. Then came the seizures. It started in schools, then hospitals, orphanages, refugee camps. One by one, Force-sensitive children were taken, by the thousands, then the millions. Most were under the age of 7. Those who resisted were sedated. Entire townships would wake to find a building emptied overnight. Families weren't notified. There were no public lists. The few who tried to search found dead ends and sealed files. Officially, the children had been relocated for sovereign service. They were never seen again. The facilities that received them were built in places thick with history, twisted remnants of what came before. On Ilum, the frozen caverns that once housed Jedi trials were excavated, the crystals mined, the structures rebuilt in obsidian. On Lothal, a ruined temple was turned into a subterranean training pit, sealed in ferrocrete. Each academy was fitted with living quarters, training chambers, punishment cells, and surveillance infrastructure that tracked every heartbeat. There were no names, only numbers. The doctrine was simple. Pain was the first teacher. Hunger followed. Students were denied food for infractions as minor as blinking during meditation. They were shocked for hesitation, punished for compassion. Those who cried were mocked, then beaten. Every bond formed between students was broken by design. Friendships were manipulated, exploited, then destroyed through betrayal exercises. One academy on Arcania required students to sleep on rotating schedules to prevent the formation of trust. Another held dueling tournaments where the loser's survival was never guaranteed. Their instructors were not clones or droids. They were former Inquisitors, Sith loyalists, and in some cases, failed experiments. Force users who had been broken beyond the point of coherent thought, now used to demonstrate what weakness led to. No student was taught restraint. Anger was praised. Outbursts rewarded. To reach for balance was to invite punishment. To show kindness was to risk extermination. Every 6 months a culling was held. The lowest performing students, based on aggression, power output and combat skill, were removed from the program. Not expelled, removed. Those left behind never asked where they went. They had learned not to speak out of turn. Lightsabers were earned, not given. Before construction, each student was required to take a life, with bare hands or borrowed blade. The crystal was assigned by the Academy's overseer, often harvested from scavenged Jedi remnants and forced to bleed through ritual. Some students failed the bleeding process. Their crystals shattered in the forge, their minds unraveling shortly after. Those students never received replacements. Graduation was not a ceremony, it was survival. Only those who killed their instructors in a final duel were permitted to leave the Academy grounds. That final trial, known as the Rite of Ascendancy, varied in form, but never in outcome. The weak perished. The strong emerged with red sabers and new assignments. The Sith were not building philosophers, they were building weapons. By the 3rd year of the program, the results became visible. Across the Outer Rim, entire colonies were placed under the command of newly minted Dark Adepts. Each one operated as enforcer and governor, tasked with rooting out sedition and practicing their power on living subjects. Some ruled with fire and storm, others preferred silence and precision. One oversaw a desert world by forcing its people to march in circles every day under the threat of execution. No reason was given, none needed. Compassion was now classified as ideological treason. The word itself was omitted from lesson protocols. Emotions were regulated by punishment thresholds. Students who exhibited grief or sympathy were subjected to public castigation, sometimes in front of holographic projections of their own families recorded during their capture. The message was constant: love is weakness, empathy is betrayal, mercy is extinction. Despite their power, these children-turned acolytes never saw themselves as Sith Lords. That title was reserved for the rare few deemed worthy by Sidious himself. Most served as extensions of the Empire's deeper will. They enforced, interrogated, and executed. They filled the gap left by the Jedi not as protectors, but predators. The Sith of this new age did not descend from bloodline. They were born in agony, shaped in isolation, and tested through death. It was not legacy that built them, it was brutality. They owed nothing to the old ways. They had no interest in Sith tradition, no reverence for the rule of two. They knew only one rule: survive and serve. And in the cold corridors of their blackened halls, the echoes of laughter had long been replaced by screams. Knowledge became the next battlefield. The Empire understood that fear could crush rebellion, but only erasure could prevent it from rising again. So they began the systematic dismantling of information. Libraries across the core worlds, once bastions of history, science, and galactic culture, were either burned to ash or updated under state control. Any data that conflicted with sovereign doctrine was stripped from the system, not flagged, not debated, rewritten or removed entirely. Coruscant's grand repository was the first to fall. It didn't collapse in flames. It was locked down under the guise of restructuring. Citizens were told its contents were being digitized for improved access. But inside, droids equipped with electromagnetic pulses and memory splicing tools worked through the stacks, sector by sector. Historical records were truncated. First-person accounts vanished. Ancient texts were overwritten with Imperial commentary that reframed key events to favor the ruling power. Holocrons, once sacred vessels of Jedi wisdom, were specifically targeted. The few that had survived Order 66 were hunted down, collected, and shattered. Their cores, packed with compressed force imprints and encrypted insight, were extracted and uploaded into the central data stream of the Ministry of Continuity. There, the contents were filtered, reconstructed, and embedded with false narratives. Force healing became a myth. Jedi mind tricks were reframed as forms of psychic assault. Force sensitivity itself was categorized as a dangerous genetic anomaly requiring surveillance. Entire star charts were redrawn. Ancient hyperspace lanes disappeared from navigation databases. Planets like Ossus, Tython, and Jedha were removed from official records. In some cases, the coordinates were scrambled entirely, replaced with gravitational anomalies, or marked as unstable systems to discourage exploration. Pilots who attempted travel to these zones found their permits revoked, their ships impounded, and their navigation logs purged, if they returned at all. Jedi history, once preserved through generations, was now rebranded under a new term: Force terrorism. Holo lectures across educational hubs introduced the concept early, starting with children in Level 1 citizenship training. These sessions detailed the Jedi as rogue mystics who use their powers to manipulate minds, interfere with planetary leadership, and sabotage peace through shadow warfare. Mace Windu was painted as a radical separatist. Aayla Secura was shown as a seductress who swayed troops into mutiny. Even Obi-Wan Kenobi was reframed as a charismatic extremist who led children into battle. The name Yoda proved particularly dangerous. His species, never fully catalogued, became a perfect target for state-driven doubt. Ministry officials declared that no such individual had existed. Any surviving footage or voice recordings were marked as alien deepfakes, propaganda artifacts created by the rebellion to inspire sympathy. Linguists were instructed to reclassify his speech patterns as fabricated syntax, and the very word Yoda was replaced in public archives with a blank field entry. In training camps, Inquisitors made students repeat that the Jedi were the architects of chaos. Repetition, the Empire knew, could bend memory into fact. Students were rewarded for identifying subtle Jedi influence in historic art and literature. Entire artistic movements were banned on suspicion of Force symbolism. Music that featured modal intervals associated with ancient Jedi rituals was censored. Even paintings with blue and green dominating the palette were flagged for ideological review. Outside the core, regional archives were not merely altered, they were destroyed. On Naboo, a fire swept through the Theed historical vaults. On Ryloth, stormtroopers leveled an ancient temple where Jedi scrolls were stored in underground vaults. The attack was blamed on criminal insurgents. On Mandalore, after the surface was once again declared strategically compromised, Imperial excavation crews unearthed Force relics only to melt them into metal for construction plating. Information became a tool, but more than that, it became a weapon. Access was granted only to those with high loyalty scores and biometric clearance. Entire academic fields, philosophy, comparative history, exoanthropology, were stripped from the standard curriculum. Citizens knew only what the sovereign permitted. And if a question could not be answered by the state, the question was labeled heretical. The phrase "the Force" itself was reduced to a technical designation. It was no longer treated as a mystical current, but a biological function manipulated by dangerous individuals. High-level researchers developed terms like neuropathic resonance and quantum instinct reflex to replace the ancient language. Those who used the original terms were dismissed, detained, or disappeared. And so, the past fractured, not through neglect, through precision, through policy, through the calculated silencing of everything that could remind the galaxy of what it once believed in. Some still remembered. A few fragments survived, locked in private vaults, spoken in code, hidden in etchings beneath alley walls. But the average citizen had never heard of the Clone Wars, never knew who built the Jedi Temple, and never asked why the stars had fewer names than they once did. The Empire didn't fear knowledge, it learned how to control it. Coruscant was once the jewel of the galaxy, an endless city of light, suspended across layers of history. After the Empire's full consolidation of power, it became something else entirely. Not destroyed, not abandoned, just hollowed. The surface structures remained, but their purpose was rewritten. The city's light dimmed, not from catastrophe, but from control. The Senate Rotunda, once echoing with the clash of voices and policy, was silenced permanently. Its seats remained, but each one was now guarded by a motionless statue. Sith lords from centuries past, some real, others conjured by myth, now loomed over the chamber in polished obsidian. Each statue bore an engraved aphorism, quotes praising loyalty, fear, subjugation. Senators no longer gathered to speak. Instead, they filed in during monthly compliance sessions, heads bowed, while state-selected broadcasts echoed through the chamber. Debate was no longer part of governance. Presence was enough. High above, the Jedi Temple no longer stood as a beacon. The spires remained, but their meaning was turned inside out. The central sanctuary was restructured into an execution ground. Not a secret one. Public, performative. A coliseum with seating, stage lighting, and live feeds routed across the entire planet. Traitors were marched in, often gagged and shackled, then subjected to justice as defined by the Empire. Death by saber, blaster, or force, depending on who was watching. On some occasions, Darth Solace presided. Other times, it was nameless inquisitors, masked and silent. The message was clear. This was the fate of heresy. Sky traffic, once chaotic and vibrant, now followed strict patterns. Civilian vessels were restricted to 2 vertical levels, both well below the skyline. These zones were policed by TIE patrol units with standing orders to disable any ship deviating from its designated corridor. Above those levels, only military transports and official Imperial fleets moved freely. Even courier droids required biometric tagging. The joy of flying, once woven into Coruscanti culture, was reduced to monitored transit under constant threat of redirection, or worse. Ground movement followed a similar pattern. Surveillance towers were erected in every district, stretching from the upper city all the way to the underworld's shadowed depths. These towers operated on rotating shifts of AI-driven monitoring, equipped with facial scanners, thermal sensors, and biometric tagging arrays. Every citizen's face was scanned every 5 seconds. The system tracked pupil dilation, micro-expressions, stress indicators. Suspicion didn't require an action, just a blink held too long. Those flagged were marked in red on the citywide grid and intercepted within minutes. A new sound became part of the Coruscant atmosphere. The mechanical click of camera turrets adjusting, refocusing, recalibrating. The hum of tracking drones became more familiar than the chirp of conversation. Children learned to avoid making faces in public. Adults learned to speak in low tones. Even joy in excess was watched. Laughter was not banned, but it became rare. People found safer things to do, like walk straight and keep their eyes down. The city itself began to change in material. New construction projects replaced public gardens, recreational plazas, and monuments with black Durasteel structures. The color scheme was uniform: grey, dark grey, or black. Reflections vanished. Windows were tinted to prevent unapproved light displays. Entire buildings that once hosted theaters or cultural centers were repurposed into administration towers for compliance review. Others were simply demolished. No announcements, no memorials. The planet's natural night-day cycle was masked by artificial gloom. The skies above the city's top layer were shielded with orbital panels that redirected sunlight according to a state-approved schedule. It was always either overcast or artificially dimmed. Even when the sun technically rose, the lower levels remained dark. Only select areas were granted enhanced illumination, usually near government buildings or military hubs. The rest of the city lived in a kind of extended twilight. Public holidays were replaced with loyalty observances. Citizens lined up not to celebrate, but to demonstrate. They recited chants, held banners, and watched as convoys passed overhead in symbolic formation. Mandatory attendance was enforced through ID chip scans. Those absent without permission were noted, tracked, and summoned. Eventually, people stopped resisting and began planning for it like a second job. Beneath it all, whispers still existed. In the underlevels, where the light never reached, old symbols were carved into rusted panels. Jedi sigils scratched into the backs of transport crates. Rebel phrases, half erased, still faintly legible on elevator walls. Children asked questions their parents didn't answer. Old slicers, long retired, exchanged data fragments that weren't supposed to exist. But above them, the weight of the Empire was unshakable. Coruscant no longer felt alive. It functioned, yes. It moved. It breathed in the way machines breathe. Regulated, predictable, unfeeling. The pulse of the galaxy's capital had not stopped, but it had changed rhythm. Slower, heavier. And somewhere in its endless sprawl, the stars that once shimmered above were now a rumor, flickering behind layers of darkness no one remembered how to break. When the war ended and the Jedi were gone, the clones who had helped execute Order 66 were left scattered, aging, and increasingly irrelevant. For the Empire, they were both asset and liability, living weapons with fading purpose and too many memories. So a solution was introduced: reclamation through reintegration. It started quietly. A few battalions were reassigned to outer colonies. Others were sent to veteran sanctuaries constructed by Imperial Health Command. On the surface, it looked like retirement. But there were no parades, no honors, just silence and sedatives. Each clone was subjected to a neurological reset protocol, marketed as cognitive realignment therapy. In truth, it was a mind wipe. Memories of Jedi commanders, battlefield loyalty, and independent thought were stripped. What remained was a shell of function. These clones were reassigned to menial roles: loading docks, orbital relays, waste disposal facilities. Their former designations were erased and replaced with serial tags that did not correspond to any known military classification. They worked, slept, and faded. Some noticed: former officers, medics, a few civilians. But any record linking a clone to his original identity was sealed. Attempts to reconnect with old brothers were met with reassignment or disappearance. Clones who retained fragments of their past, those who remembered names like Rex, Cody, or Fives, were quietly removed from circulation, one by one. But the Empire wasn't done with the cloning program, not by any stretch. A new generation was designed, this time without the flaw of memory. These weren't based solely on Jango Fett. Genetic donors were diversified to optimize physical and cognitive traits. And loyalty wasn't programmed as behavior. It was hard-coded into their biology. Emotional dampeners, rage triggers, and reward response loops were embedded from gestation. These clones didn't question orders because they couldn't imagine doing so. They didn't form bonds. They didn't hesitate. They didn't age at the same accelerated rate. There were plans for long-term deployment. Cloning had evolved into something far more sinister. Kamino, once the heart of the program, was no longer useful. The facilities were too well known, too exposed, and operated by a species that asked too many questions. After a series of controlled weather anomalies, massive oceanic storms swept across the cities. The cloning platforms collapsed one by one. No evacuation warnings were sent. No distress signals reached the outside. Kamino's archives sank beneath waves engineered by the Empire's own geo-manipulators. Off-world cloning centers emerged in deep space, stations with no official designation, hidden behind sensor veils and wrapped in gravitational anomalies. They were built not to serve, but to produce, endlessly and without oversight. Biopods lined endless chambers, each nurturing a being destined for exact obedience. Technicians were rotated every 3 months to prevent emotional attachment. No names were used. The clones were referred to only by their unit series and operational category. The original clones, those who had fought in the Clone Wars, were now seen as outdated, even dangerous. Some had escaped the reintegration process. A few formed quiet enclaves. Others became mercenaries, drifters, or unknowns lost to the galaxy's forgotten systems. But the Empire never stopped hunting them. Designated as rogue assets, they were not offered capture. The order was termination and disassembly. Kill first, recover the body, wipe the genome. The term Order 66 was buried so deeply within classified files that even high-ranking Moffs could no longer access it. It was referred to only by numerical code, Project Sunder, and locked behind multiple biometric gates. Any mention of it in public speech, media, or academic discourse was flagged as treasonous misinformation. Even the name Clone Trooper was phased out, replaced with newer designations like Sovereign Infantry or Protocol Enforcer. Language moved on. The truth did not. Holonovels and state media reframed the original clones as a failed experiment, unstable, emotionally volatile, and tragically dependent on flawed behavioral chips. The new generation was portrayed as the Empire's perfected answer to military inconsistency, not soldiers with stories, just numbers, tools, clean, reliable, repeatable. The cloning program had achieved what the Sith desired: replication without risk, loyalty without soul. These new creations didn't wear colors. They didn't customize armor. They didn't give themselves nicknames. There were no Fives, no Wolves, no Echoes, just squads of genetically sculpted silence, marching to a rhythm designed by something colder than war. This was the Empire's new foundation. Not stormtroopers trained into service, not citizens called into ranks. Manufactured allegiance, endless, flawless, disposable. And for every unit that faltered, another was already waiting in stasis. The Outer Rim was never conquered in a single strike. It was absorbed, restructured under layers of bureaucracy and brute force. Once a vast frontier of independent worlds, rogue trade networks, and quiet rebellion, it was renamed by Imperial decree, the Industrial March. Not a nickname, a formal reclassification. Sector governors received new orders, system names were deleted, planets were assigned numerical codes and production quotas. Individual identity gave way to function. Each world was categorized based on its output potential: raw materials, labor volume, energy yield, geological flexibility. No consideration was given to population, culture, or sentience. A lush oceanic planet with aquatic civilizations was converted into a refinery zone for ore processing. The oceans were drained. The inhabitants were relocated to holding sectors. There was no appeal process. Once designated, a planet's fate was locked. Languages native to the Outer Rim were outlawed in public and private use. Twi'leki, Huteze, Shiriwuk, and dozens more were deemed incompatible with Imperial cohesion. Basic became the sole legal language for instruction, communication, and documentation. Schools were mandated to erase all previous dialects from their curriculum. Cultural festivals were replaced with labor holidays. Translation droids were reprogrammed to ignore non-basic commands. Terraforming projects began on a massive scale. Resource-rich planets were altered without hesitation. Volcanoes were induced to release rare minerals. Deserts were converted into chemical scrub zones. Jungles were replaced with synthetic agriculture optimized for military ration production. In some cases, entire ecosystems were sterilized to make way for industrial platforms. Native life forms, intelligent or not, were labeled as non-essential and removed. The Empire didn't announce these changes. There were no speeches, no grand banners declaring control. Instead, it began with shipments, endless cargo freighters, terraforming drones, atmospheric disruptors. Outposts became fortresses. Fortresses became cities of smoke and steel. Resistance began to stir in pockets, but before they could form networks, they were crushed. The Imperial Security Bureau expanded its reach into the Outer Rim under a new directive: preemptive containment. Slicers intercepted private transmissions. Movement across planets was restricted. Family units suspected of housing former rebels were relocated without notice. Anyone asking too many questions disappeared into the cold cells of mobile interrogation barges. The few who escaped described something worse than torture: forgetting who they were. Even the stars seemed to fade. Pollution from massive factory complexes dimmed planetary skies. Orbiting debris from dismantled moons disrupted navigation. Once busy space lanes fell silent. The Outer Rim, once full of smugglers, wanderers, and travelers, became a corridor of silence, patrolled by cruisers, shielded by bureaucracy, hidden beneath layers of Imperial renaming. Cartographers no longer labeled systems by heritage or discovery. Everything had a designation now. Sector T-45, Extraction Zone 7, Thermal Grid Core 2. It didn't matter what the planet had been, only what it produced now. That was the rule of the Industrial March. And in the stillness of its controlled silence, the last sparks of independence flickered and vanished. Alderaan didn't fade quietly. It was obliterated, shattered into a field of drifting stone and frozen screams. But for the Empire, its death was never just a moment. It became ritual. Every year, on the galactic calendar, the destruction of Alderaan was replayed across holoscreens and public squares, not as mourning, as warning. The broadcast always began the same way: a fabricated communication intercept from a supposed insurgent cell. In it, masked figures plotted an attack on the Death Star using an experimental core destabilizer, an invention that never existed. The footage cut to a reenactment showing the Empire's response, edited for drama and compliance with sovereign doctrine. The Death Star fires. The planet disappears in a flash of light. Then the announcer delivers the same line each year: treason ends in silence. The people of the core cheered. The mid-rim watched in uneasy quiet. But in the Outer Rim, where many remembered Alderaan not as a threat but as a center of peace and diplomacy, viewing was mandatory. Troopers enforced attendance in public squares. Students were required to recite approved lines afterward. Any visible grief or hesitation was reported. Survivors, few as they were, became targets. Those off-world at the time, ambassadors, students, medics, were rounded up and relocated to floating penal stations in deep space. These installations weren't designed for punishment. They were built for disappearance. No names, no visitor logs. Their existence denied by official channels. One station, known only as K-Lum Prime, rotated silently in the shadow of a dead star, holding hundreds of Alderaanians whose only crime was survival. Entire family lines were ended administratively, birth certificates invalidated, wills overwritten, personal databanks scrubbed. Descendants were reassigned to labor sectors under assumed origin codes. If asked, they were born on Corellia or Naboo or anywhere else. They were discouraged from asking questions. They were never told where their parents had truly come from. Children of Alderaanian lineage were enrolled in historical adjustment programs. These educational clinics implanted altered memory sequences, synthetic recollections of growing up on approved worlds, participating in approved customs. For many, the deception worked. A few retained flashes, dreams of gardens, songs with no known origin, the echo of a name that felt like home. Most learned quickly not to speak of them. Leia Organa's name became a target of deletion. She was labeled the chief architect of the Alderaanian terror plot, accused of plotting to assassinate Imperial leaders during peace negotiations. Her image was scrubbed from all diplomatic footage. Her senatorial records were burned. The role she played in the rebellion was reframed into that of a rogue aristocrat who abandoned her people for personal power. Speaking her name publicly was grounds for re-education. Writing it resulted in detainment. In many systems, it became a banned term in search engines and communication filters. The beauty Alderaan once embodied, its snow-covered peaks, transparent crystal lakes, its ornate towers blending art and function, was reduced to a set of weaponized images. Before and after comparisons were used in loyalty seminars. This was the price of weakness, students were told. This was the result of peace without vigilance. The Empire didn't bury Alderaan's memory. It bent it. No efforts were made to preserve the site. The asteroid field that remained was deemed a restricted zone, cordoned off by military beacons. The excuse was navigational hazard. In truth, it kept mourners and truth-seekers away. Still, a few made the pilgrimage, pilots in old transports, smugglers with stories, force sensitives drawn by echoes in the debris. Most didn't return. A few passed along hushed rumors of silent orbits, strange force echoes, or drifting fragments of homes frozen in time. Propaganda holodramas featured fictional versions of Alderaan's final days. In one, Leia was portrayed as an unstable zealot who threatened to detonate her own planet to spark galactic revolt. In another, Bail Organa was shown smuggling weapons through diplomatic channels, hiding bombs inside Senate vessels. None of these depictions resembled the truth. That was the point. Truth no longer mattered. Only memory did, and memory could be shaped. The few remnants of Alderaanian culture that survived, its architecture, its music, its poetry, were labeled unauthorized nostalgia and banned from transmission. Instruments native to Alderaan were confiscated in port searches. Fashion styles originating from the planet were rebranded or suppressed. A culture spanning thousands of years was flattened in less than 2 generations. But in quiet corners of the galaxy, in back rooms and whisper channels, the name Alderaan still meant something. Not as a place, as a question. One that didn't need to be spoken aloud. What if they hadn't lost? With the rebellion extinguished and galactic resistance fragmented beyond recovery, The Empire no longer relied solely on governors and military bureaucracy. Instead, it shifted to something far older and far more enduring: dynasty. Power was no longer just assigned, it was inherited. Elite imperial families were granted control over entire systems, handpicked by the sovereign himself. These were not figureheads or ceremonial nobles. They were enforcers in silk, rulers in name and in practice. Planets became estates, sectors turned into fiefdoms. Each bloodline was assigned a title reflecting its function: High Executor, Lord Regional, Sovereign Custodian. These weren't ranks that could be lost. They were written into the genetic record of each heir. Children born into these dynasties were not raised by parents. They were raised by doctrine. From infancy, they were isolated in conditioning chambers, silent rooms with regulated temperature, light exposure, and psychological stimuli calibrated to shape behavior. Caretakers were rotated frequently to prevent emotional bonding. Vocabulary was taught early, but warmth was withheld. These children were trained to speak before they could walk. They memorized compliance codes before they learned their own names. By the time they were 5, they had studied economic control theory, population manipulation, and military logistics. By 10, they were executing loyalty tests on servants. Empathy was considered a defect. Those who failed to show detachment were flagged for correction, a process whose specifics remained off record, but after which the child always returned, changed. Marriage, once a personal or cultural union, became a calculated move. Alliances were forged through genetic compatibility, not affection. Traits like heightened aggression, resilience to interrogation, and strategic aptitude were ranked and selected. Romance was absent from these unions. Offspring were produced by agreement, raised as tools, and cycled into the system. Love, in any form, was a weakness that no noble house could afford. Genetic modification quietly became standard. Augmented vision, rapid healing, extended cognition cycles. These procedures were performed in off-world medical vaults, kept far from civilian oversight. They weren't advertised, but the results were visible. Lords and ladies of the Empire who never aged, never tired, never faltered in speech or judgment. Some were rumored to have full cortical interfaces, allowing them to process battlefield data in real time while negotiating planetary trade deals. As decades passed, blood itself became political capital. Lineage charts were tracked with obsessive precision. Marriages required sovereign approval, and unauthorized unions were dissolved, sometimes violently. The purer the line, the greater the authority. Infertility was treated as a threat to succession and often replaced with forced cloning initiatives. The original genome remained paramount. This hierarchy bled into every level of power. Mid-ranking officers bowed lower to nobles than to moffs. Dissenters who harmed a blooded heir were executed without trial, regardless of circumstance. Disputes between families were settled through sanctioned duels. Legalized murder framed as honor rituals, complete with formal witnesses and ancestral banners. On Coruscant and select capital worlds, entire districts were sealed off for dynastic use. No outsiders entered. Every surface glowed with cold opulence. Hollow portraits of heirs lined the walls, each one composed to emphasize superiority. No casual clothing, no unsanctioned expressions. Perfection in appearance mirrored perfection in power. Even the stars bore their influence. Star destroyers were renamed after dynastic lines: Vigilance of Karna, Wrathlight Ascendant, Edorith's Will. These ships didn't just carry troops, they carried symbols. Presence alone could end a planetary dispute. In this new structure, power no longer came from loyalty. It came from legacy, and those without legacy had no place. The Force had always breathed across the galaxy in quiet harmony, rising and falling, flowing between light and shadow. The Jedi understood that balance wasn't stillness, it was motion. But when the light was silenced and darkness grew unchecked, the balance didn't tip, it broke. The first cracks began with the destruction of light-side nexuses. These weren't just sacred sites, they were living conduits of clarity and vision. Dagobah, long steeped in ancient energies, was one of the earliest targets. Imperial agents, guided by Sith diviners, conducted deep core detonations that fractured the planet's crust and disrupted its natural alignment with the Force. The swamps began to rot. Wildlife turned aggressive and erratic. What was once a sanctuary of reflection became a place of fevered hallucination. Lothal followed, a planet known for its strange convergence of Force-rich ley lines. It was gutted under the guise of urban redevelopment. The ancient Jedi temple hidden beneath its surface was excavated, its murals scraped clean, its chambers torn apart for study. Once the excavation was complete, the site was collapsed intentionally. Local flora died within weeks. Nights became unnaturally long. Dreams twisted into waking visions. People fled, but no one could explain what had changed, only that it had. These weren't isolated events. Across the galaxy, any location known to have radiated calm, insight, or healing was desecrated. Not just to erase history, but to sever connection. Dark rituals performed at these sites didn't simply draw power. They consumed what had once been anchored there. Sith sorcery twisted the very fabric of these nexuses. The Force, disrupted and screaming, could no longer flow freely. It pooled, became unstable, and lashed out. That instability began manifesting in new, frightening ways. Children born with Force sensitivity no longer developed in predictable patterns. Some displayed abilities far beyond their years, ripping objects apart with a glance, hearing thoughts across continents. Others were plagued by uncontrollable fits of rage, moments of paralysis, or episodes of catatonia. These weren't gifts, they were symptoms, broken reflections of a fractured Force. Entire bloodlines began to vanish. Families that once carried Force sensitivity through generations suddenly found themselves producing children untouched by the current, or worse, children with fragmented connections that flickered like damaged transmissions. A few displayed glimpses of incredible insight before collapsing into seizures. The Force no longer whispered, it howled. Prophets, seers, and visionaries, once rare but revered, were driven into madness. Visions that used to offer glimpses of future possibility now bled with screams, fire, and confusion. The past became unreliable. The future became static. Attempts to use meditation techniques from ancient texts often resulted in neural feedback, trauma, or violent rejection. Those who once felt guided by the Force now described it as something watching them, not a presence, but a predator. Across several Outer Rim sectors, Imperial medical ships were tasked with collecting Force-sensitive infants, not for training, for containment. Inside the holds of these ships, hundreds of children were kept sedated, monitored, and experimented on. Some were studied for their mutations. Others simply vanished. The Empire offered no public explanation. To most citizens, these children never existed. Not even the Sith were immune. Acolytes trained in the new academies sometimes developed unpredictable anomalies, temporary blindness, violent dissociative episodes, or inexplicable bursts of uncontrolled power that left their instructors dead and the surrounding rooms scorched. A few were transferred to secretive research stations and replaced without comment. These failures were not acknowledged in official records. Jedi artifacts recovered from the ruins began to deteriorate faster than they should. Lightsabers refused to activate. Holocrons flickered with distorted messages, some speaking in reverse, others stuck in endless loops. It was as if the very essence that had once powered them was now corrupted. Some theorized that the Kyber crystals themselves were rejecting the Force's mutation, cracking from within. The balance had always required resistance. Light pushed against dark, dark pushed back, and the result was life. But when one side was starved, bled dry by cruelty and conquest, there was no longer resistance. There was collapse, not evenly, not visibly at first, but steadily, like a structure losing internal support. The galaxy was no longer alive in the same way, and still, the rituals continued. On remote moons, Sith cultists burned offerings into the rock. On former Jedi worlds, shadowy figures chanted in languages lost to time. They thought they were ascending. They thought the darkness was theirs to command. But it wasn't submission. It was imbalance, and imbalance never stays silent. The known galaxy was no longer enough. With rebellion crushed, the Force broken, and the core locked in sterile obedience, the Empire turned its gaze outward, beyond the fringes of mapped space, into the shifting corridors of the unknown regions. Long dismissed as unstable and unchartable, these areas had once defied all navigation efforts. Gravity wells, phantom mass signatures, and false star clusters had hidden them for centuries. But the Sith found a way through. Using a combination of Force-enhanced precognition, ancient hyperspace coordinates, and experimental guidance algorithms, Sith scouts began carving safe lanes into unclaimed territory. These scouts weren't pilots in the traditional sense. They were navigators trained to read the disruptions in space-time, to feel out the distortions, and respond in real time. They operated in silence, transmitting their maps through encrypted channels that even the fleet admirals were not allowed to access. Within months, new pathways opened. What was once myth became reachable. Systems with no Republic history appeared in the archives. Entire star clusters untouched by galactic war came into focus. And waiting at the edge of this expansion stood the Chiss ascendancy. Strategic, disciplined, remote. The Chiss had long remained distant from the squabbles of the Republic and Empire alike, but they could not remain hidden forever. Thrawn, once a tactical outlier and bridge between civilizations, warned of the dangers that lurked beyond. He knew what stirred in the void, but his warnings were buried beneath politics and ambition. Internal dissent within the Ascendancy, funded in part by disguised Imperial channels, led to his isolation. Trusted allies turned. Coordinates were leaked. Thrawn was not killed. He was outmaneuvered. Imperial fleets entered Chiss territory under pretense of diplomacy. Within weeks, the defense grid was compromised. By the end of the cycle, the Ascendancy had surrendered, not to defeat, to exhaustion. Strategic cities were assimilated, military academies repurposed. The last generation of Chiss tacticians were forced into servitude, deployed as advisors under permanent surveillance. But the conquest of the unknown regions wasn't only about territory, it was about power. The Sith weren't just expanding, they were searching. Ancient threats buried in legend and exile were unearthed. Entities predating the Republic, creatures engineered during forgotten wars, fragments of civilizations that had weaponized the Force in ways even Sidious had only theorized. Some of these remnants resisted, most were bound. Ritualists extracted power, biologists harvested tissue, Sith alchemists replicated genetic anomalies. Anything that couldn't be understood was caged. Anything that could be weaponized was refined. In the remote system of Nikalth, a planetary crust was cracked to reveal a subterranean megastructure, a dormant machine world pulsing with force-neutral energy. It took 4 months of dark rituals and gravitational manipulation to restart its core. When it finally responded, it spoke not in words, but in raw frequencies that disrupted every ship in orbit. The Empire didn't shut it down. They relocated their main research station there. Elsewhere, monsters reawakened, the Leviathans of Malvor, the Screamers of the Abyss Vale, creatures too large for atmosphere, too old for reason. Their minds burned through scanners, their presence corrupted sensors. But the Sith didn't run. They fed these things blood, data, energy, and in return, the monsters became part of the fleet. The boundary between myth and matter dissolved. The unknown regions had always been described in hushed tones, full of superstition and speculation. But now, those stories had faces, and those faces had names etched into Imperial logs. The border between reality and nightmare collapsed. With each new conquest, the Empire changed. It no longer conquered in the way it once had. It didn't impose structure or spread ideology. It consumed planets, species, beliefs, even the Force itself, taken and bent towards singular will. No more treaties, no more flags, just absorption. And while the core slept in uniform silence, the edges of the galaxy roared. The Empire's final transformation wasn't cultural or territorial, it was technological. Power once drawn from numbers, strategy, and discipline was replaced by something colder, calculated supremacy driven by fusion of Sith mysticism and machine precision. Innovation no longer served the people, it served conquest. At the core of this shift stood the Kyber-powered dreadnoughts, colossal warships eclipsing even the Executor class in scale, patrolled hyperspace corridors with silent authority. Each vessel housed a Kyber crucible, massive reactors fueled by corrupted crystals harvested from destroyed Jedi temples. Unlike standard hypermatter drives, these cores thrummed with sentient energy. When these ships fired, they did more than destroy. They unraveled. Targets weren't simply obliterated, they were destabilized at a molecular level. Cities ceased to exist in bursts of unnatural silence. Standard fleet command was replaced by something far more reactive. Force-sensitive AI interfaces. These weren't droids or protocols. They were living intelligences constructed from neural lattice patterns sourced from Sith archives and spliced with midichlorian-rich tissue cultures. Each ship's AI could sense imminent danger, detect betrayal from crew members, or respond to precognitive threats in hyperspace. They didn't calculate odds. They felt outcomes. Some captains described their vessels whispering warnings before alarms ever sounded. This technology bled into the bodies of the Sith themselves. Cybernetic augmentation had once been seen as weakness, a necessary evil. No longer. The new generation of Sith sought out modification as a rite of evolution. Eyes replaced with Kyber-filtered lenses that could read emotions like heat signatures. Vocal cords replaced with harmonic modulator implants to induce compliance in those nearby. Organs enhanced to survive vacuum exposure, lightsaber wounds, and force lightning surges. Mortality was an outdated constraint. Identity became modular. These Cyber Sith weren't just commanders. They were living siege engines, walking interfaces capable of controlling drones, war machines, and orbital defenses through direct neural uplink. A single gesture could trigger planetary bombardment. Thought alone could reroute entire squadrons. They became the Empire's gods in flesh and circuit. Inquisitors received upgrades of their own. Their sabers, already lethal, were now integrated with biofeedback processors linked to spinal implants. These weapons adjusted blade intensity mid-swing, rebalanced grip alignment in response to muscle fatigue, and reacted before conscious movement. Combat became predictive, not reactive. A fight wasn't won. It was preordained by feedback algorithms and force echo resonance. The Inquisitor became a conductor, blade, body, and mind in perfect, terrifying synchrony. Meanwhile, planets themselves became targets of transformation. Terraforming engines, colossal constructs dropped from orbit, descended on lush, fertile worlds without warning. Within hours, they punctured planetary crusts, unleashing chemical storms and rapid biome conversion. Forests wilted under synthetic cloud cover. Oceans darkened as atmospheric processes seeded them with control agents. Wildlife adapted or perished. Entire planetary ecologies were rewritten in days, not for habitation, for resource extraction, weapon testing, or simple demonstration of dominance. One such engine, deployed over the garden moon of Veltria, darkened the skies within 16 hours. A population of 3 million vanished. No evacuation, no resistance. Satellite footage caught a final glimpse of flowers turning black, their petals hardening into brittle glass-like structures as the wind howled through empty fields. What was once a sanctuary became a barren plain of industrial scaffolding and automated harvesters. The Empire no longer fought in the traditional sense. There were no negotiations, no escalation, no siege. Engagements were decided before a weapon was drawn. A system declared disloyal would lose power, atmosphere, and orbiting infrastructure within hours. Targets weren't suppressed. They were dissected. Information warfare, psychic interference, kinetic strikes, and nanite infiltration happened simultaneously. There were no survivors, just compliance metrics and system resets. And the most terrifying aspect wasn't what the technology could do. It was that it kept learning. The Force AI hybrids developed patterns. They studied rebellion not as threat, but as a data stream. Every insurrection became a lesson. Every resistance cell became a test case. By the third year of full deployment, uprisings dropped to zero. Not because hope died, because strategy became impossible. The Sith didn't just create weapons. They created inevitability. The Force was never just energy. It was connection. Across the galaxy, it moved like a current between life forms, ideas, and instincts. When that current was broken, the effect wasn't just spiritual. It was neurological, biological. The suppression of the light, once thought to only affect Jedi and sensitives, began to fracture minds at scale. The first symptoms were dismissed: isolated breakdowns, brief episodes of hallucination. But patterns emerged quickly and spread faster than the Empire could contain. In the labor blocks of Nar Hexa, thousands of enslaved workers began reporting identical dreams, visions of endless voids, voices whispering from cold, directionless space. Within weeks, over a third of the workforce stopped speaking altogether, not out of defiance but collapse. They wandered aimlessly between shifts. Some refused food. Others stood motionless in the rain for hours, muttering fragments of forgotten languages. Supervisors who tried to intervene described an overwhelming sense of nausea. Several took their own lives without explanation. Similar incidents spread through the mid-rim: mining colonies, prison barges, indoctrination academies. Groups of unrelated citizens began experiencing collective psychotic breaks. They described the same symbols, the same fevered songs. Entire workforces succumbed to panic over non-existent threats, clawing at their own faces, screaming about eyes behind the stars. One station broadcast a distress signal in reverse, repeating the phrase, "The light is screaming," For 6 hours until the signal was cut, the system was quarantined. No follow-up was issued. Children born during this era showed disturbing deviations. Some were mute, not due to injury or trauma, but total neurological absence of speech development. Others displayed hyper-aggressive behavior within days of birth. Infants with abnormal adrenal responses, spiked cortisol levels, and eyes that remained fixed on corners of the room long before developing motor control. Force-sensitive offspring, particularly in outer rim sectors, were increasingly classified as volatile, capable of spontaneous discharges of energy even while unconscious. The Empire didn't train them, they sedated them. By the time the first entire colony disappeared, the pattern could no longer be denied. Dorathan's Hollow was a farming settlement with a population of 37,000. One day, communication ceased. Probes sent to investigate found the buildings intact. Lights still flickered. Meals were still warm. But no bodies were found, no blood, no distress calls, just rows of empty homes and a central square filled with hundreds of ceremonial robes folded in perfect spirals. No signs of violence, no survivors. The system was removed from trade routes. The incident was labeled atmospheric instability. Internal files called it derangement-triggered collective migration. A second colony vanished 3 months later. This time, the inhabitants left messages, carved into walls, scrawled on ceilings, etched into glass with fingernails. The most common phrase, "We are unanchored." Another message, repeated across 7 different structures, was far more cryptic. "The Force weeps, and no one listens." Imperial medics created a new category for the phenomenon, Force derangement syndrome. It was described clinically as a form of mass neurosomatic trauma induced by long-term exposure to force field disruption. The files were heavily redacted. Most doctors weren't allowed to use the term publicly. Those who did found themselves reassigned or detained. In the citadel of Sector 9, a classified report detailed that 1 in 5 Imperial enforcers stationed in heavily suppressed regions had experienced some form of sensory distortion, auditory hallucinations, paranoia, disassociation. Many attributed it to burnout, but others knew better. The deeper the Empire pushed its suppression, through Sith rituals, kyber manipulation, planetary desecration, the more minds began to fracture. None of this was ever acknowledged from the top. The Sovereign remained publicly silent. Not one address, not one statement. While the galaxy trembled under the weight of its own unraveling, Palpatine sat upon his throne, eyes closed, mouth still. Whispers in his court claimed he was feeding on the chaos, that the madness was a consequence of his growing connection to the raw, imbalanced force. Others believed the silence meant something worse, that even he no longer controlled what had been set loose. Whatever the truth, it was clear the galaxy was no longer simply ruled. It was unraveling. The mind, once the final refuge of the oppressed, had become just another battlefield. For decades, resistance had meant death. Hope, if it existed at all, lived in sealed vaults, encrypted fragments, and the minds of the forgotten. But power never truly eliminates its opposite. It only delays it. Beneath the smothering weight of the Sith's total control, a murmur began to form, faint and scattered, yet undeniably real. It started with a rumor. A child, born on a prison moon in the Palemian Drift, reportedly resisted a full Sith mental probe without shielding or sedation. The Inquisitor in charge, well documented for an unbroken record of psychic extractions, collapsed after contact. No footage was released. The station went dark. 2 weeks later, every official aboard was reassigned or declared deceased. The child's name was deleted. But in worker camps across the Outer Rim, whispers spread of a girl with golden eyes who stared into darkness and watched it blink. In a system once dismissed as defunct, an ancient hyperspace signature pulsed into existence. It flickered for only seconds before vanishing, but its pattern aligned with Jedi-era transport routes last recorded during the High Republic. The coordinates hovered near Dantooine, a world long stripped and scorched by Empire-led excavation. Nothing was supposed to remain. Yet scavengers reported strange light patterns above the ruins. One scout described an invisible shape, felt, not seen, drifting above the planet like a memory trying to reassemble itself. The word Leia returned, though not through speech. In the droid assembly yards of Sarnax 5, labor bots began emitting a low-frequency hum while charging. At first, it was dismissed as a software glitch. But the sound formed repeating patterns, 5 distinct notes that matched an old Alderaanian lullaby. When translated through melodic code filters, the final bars revealed a message embedded in song: Leia lives in the silence of fire. No droid in the system had access to pre-Imperial databases. Technicians were replaced. The singing resumed 3 days later. Elsewhere, on a derelict transport adrift near the ghost fields of Maigito, scavengers discovered a fractured holocron, its outer casing scorched, its matrix core barely functional. After days of cautious repair, it powered on for 13 seconds. What it revealed was not a map, not a prophecy, but a single recorded lesson. The voice was unmistakable: Obi-Wan Kenobi. His face flickered, incomplete, but the words were clear. A Jedi does not vanish. A Jedi becomes what is needed. Then the light cut out, and the holocron crumbled. The Empire never acknowledged the event, but across 7 monitored sectors, the words began to spread. Not in holonet messages or encrypted calls, but through glyphs, on walls, in alley dust, etched into rations crates. A single name, always misspelled slightly to slip past scanners: Skywalker, Skywalker, SKY, repeated in patterns too deliberate to dismiss. Surveillance systems flagged it. Commanders ordered sweep after sweep, but the name returned, quiet, persistent, unclaimed. None of these events could be confirmed independently. Each existed in rumor, anomaly reports, or footnotes buried under reclassification notices. But the pattern was unmistakable. Something was shifting. The Force didn't roar back into the galaxy. It didn't announce itself in lightning or prophecy. It moved as it always had, between cracks, beneath notice, inside the ordinary. The Sith had consumed the light, but they had never understood its nature. It didn't demand attention. It didn't seek dominion. It adapted. And as the Empire marched on, its fleets patrolling the lifeless stars, its governors enforcing silence, a faint current moved against it. Not organized, not led, just felt. Hope didn't return as a banner. It returned as a whisper, and it was starting to spread. Control was never enough for Sidious. Not when systems knelt, not when the Jedi vanished, not even when time itself bent to his will. Beneath the layers of ritual, calculation, and absolute command, something more primitive stirred. Fear, not of rebellion, not of betrayal, but of death. The immortal sovereign had silenced every voice except one, the one that reminded him that flesh decays. And so he acted. Deep within the forbidden laboratories of Exegol, unlisted, unscanned, absent from star maps, he began creating bodies, not successors, not heirs, extensions, each one crafted from his own genetic matter, refined through Sith alchemy and force-warped biotechnology. The first few were near-perfect mirrors, aged to match his own form. But they didn't last. Even preserved in stasis, The dark side corroded them faster than they could be used, so he adjusted. The later clones grew stranger. One bore 4 arms, each capable of wielding a saber with different combat styles simultaneously. Another had no eyes, yet possessed spatial awareness that extended several kilometers beyond the walls of its chamber. A third radiated force static so intense it disrupted droids and caused temporary blindness in nearby guards. These weren't bodies for public use. They were weapons, contingency hosts in case his own shell failed. Each experiment deepened his isolation. The council chambers fell silent. Commands were issued through intermediaries. The people no longer saw their emperor, only his decrees. Yet the more Sidious withdrew, the more noise stirred among the Sith. Apprentices, once loyal, began to maneuver. Whispers spread among the Inquisitors, the Cyber Sith, and the Force-bred enforcers who patrolled the Outer Rim. They saw his silence not as strength, but as absence. Without his direct presence, hierarchies shifted. Skirmishes broke out between acolyte factions, each led by self-proclaimed heirs who believed themselves the next rightful vessel of darkness. Entire sects turned on one another in shadow wars fought with sabers, assassinations, and memory tampering. Sidious allowed it. Conflict sharpened the blade. But one blade turned slightly, just slightly, off script. Luke Skywalker, or what remained of him, had long since taken the name Darth Solace. For years he moved across systems as Sidious' most effective weapon. His past was buried, his crystal bled red, his mind reshaped, yet cracks had begun to form. He hesitated before executions. He stared at twin moons for too long. He touched objects and saw flashes of places he didn't recognize, yet somehow knew. The spark wasn't rebellion, not yet. But the illusion of full control had slipped. The programming that once ensured obedience no longer held perfectly. In one forgotten outpost, Luke spared a child. No one reported it. No one had to. Sidious felt it. That night, the Emperor did not sleep. He stared into the cloning tank of a new form, this one covered in living armor that pulsed with embedded kyber fragments, and felt it twitch before its nerves had even fully grown. He knew what it meant. His hold on Luke was faltering, his dominance over his acolytes thinning. His contingency bodies were functional, but incomplete. The rituals worked, but the results decayed faster. The ritual of domination required certainty, and now, just now, he wasn't certain. For the first time in decades, Sidious feared death again. The fear wasn't loud. It didn't shout. It crept, in his gait, in the coldness of his breath, in the shadows of the throne room, where no apprentice was allowed to stand too long. He doubled the surveillance on Exegol, tripled the monitoring around Luke, redoubled efforts to silence the Force's flickers across the galaxy. But the movement had already begun, not from armies, from anomalies. The cracks weren't large, but they spread. The title of Immortal Sovereign still held weight. His voice still shook planets. But behind closed doors, beneath the hiss of cloning fluid and the silence of engineered bodies, Palpatine began to count days again. Not forward, backward.